The Winter War, 1939 to 1940, Finland versus Soviet Union, David versus Goliath in the snow. The Winter War, 1939 to 1940, tells the remarkable story of how tiny Finland, facing one of the most powerful military forces in the world, the Soviet Union, stood its ground in an epic fight for survival. More than a battle over borders, it was a fight for freedom, sovereignty, and national identity. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Finnish people used their mastery of the harsh winter terrain, brilliant tactics like the moti, and sheer determination to resist overwhelming odds. This is the story of how courage, resilience, and strategy can overcome brute force, a true David versus Goliath in the snow. On November 30th, 1939, under the heavy skies of Finland's frozen forests, the Soviet Union, then one of the most powerful military forces on the planet, launched a brutal invasion against one of the smallest countries in Europe. Thus began the Winter War, one of the most extraordinary episodes of resistance in modern history, where a people armed only with their courage, their land, and their spirit stood against the largest army in the world. The context behind the conflict was, from the start, profoundly strategic. After signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union secretly divided Eastern Europe into zones of influence. Finland fell within the Soviet sphere. Stalin's justification was the proximity of the Finnish border to Leningrad, just 32 kilometers away. The safety of that city, vital to the heart of the Soviet Union, demanded, according to Moscow, that the Finnish borders be pushed back. The demands were explicit: cede territory in Karelia, islands in the Gulf of Finland, and grant the Soviet Union the Hanko Peninsula for a military base. Finland, fearing this was merely the first step toward total annexation, refused outright. Stalin then resorted to a strategy he would repeat throughout the coming decades: manufacturing a false flag incident. On November 26, 1939, the Soviets claimed Finnish artillery had shelled the Soviet village of Manila, killing Soviet soldiers. It was later proven that the Soviets themselves had fired into their own territory to fabricate a pretext for invasion. 4 days later, the assault began. Around 450,000 Soviet soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks, planes, and artillery pieces, crossed the border. Helsinki and other cities were bombed, hundreds of civilians died, and an utterly unequal war began. On the Finnish side, there were roughly 300,000 soldiers, most of them civilians turned into fighters. A mere 32 outdated tanks, fewer than 120 aircraft, many obsolete. The Soviet superiority was overwhelming. More than 6,500 tanks, nearly 4,000 aircraft, and an artillery force capable of firing tens of thousands of shells per day. However, there was one critical factor Stalin completely underestimated: the battlefield itself. Finland in winter is a natural fortress. Dense forests, frozen lakes, snow-covered swamps, and temperatures that frequently drop below -40°C create a lethal environment for anyone unprepared. The narrow, sparse roads became deadly traps. Soviet tanks bogged down in snow, trucks froze solid, and soldiers, without adequate clothing, began dying not from bullets, but from the cold. Meanwhile, the Finns, using skis, sleds, and perfect snow camouflage, moved like shadows, striking from all sides, attacking and disappearing. In this scenario, the most brilliant Finnish strategy emerged, a tactic that would become a textbook example of modern asymmetric warfare: the moti. Derived from a Finnish word meaning pile of logs, the concept involves slicing Soviet columns, moving along the roads, isolating small groups, blocking their supply routes, and then methodically and brutally destroying each pocket. Soviet columns, stretching for dozens of kilometers, became easy prey. Barricades made from felled trees, snow, and improvised mines blocked the roads. The Finns would attack the front and rear vehicles, isolate segments of the column, and trap the Soviets into pockets, the motis, where they were completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, ammunition, shelter, and communication. Terror spread rapidly. Isolated in the freezing cold, Soviet soldiers froze in makeshift trenches. Many starved before direct combat even began. At night, the sound of skis slicing through the snow was like an omen of death. Small Finnish squads would silently approach, throw grenades, fire with precision, and vanish into the darkness. The apex of this strategy was the Battle of Suomussalmi, where a Finnish force of 11,000 men, armed almost exclusively with rifles, Molotov cocktails, and a few pieces of light artillery, annihilated 2 Soviet divisions totaling 35,000 soldiers. It became one of the most humiliating defeats in Soviet military history. Shortly after, on the legendary Rate Road, the 44th Soviet Division, comprising 17,000 soldiers, was completely annihilated. Barely 1,000 survived. Over 270 trucks, dozens of tanks, and tons of supplies and weaponry were destroyed or captured. The images of the road littered with frozen corpses, burned vehicles, and debris became the definitive symbol of Soviet failure. Meanwhile, one name was rising to legend: Simo Häyhä, known as the White Death. Using a motion nagant rifle without a scope to avoid glare, buried in the snow, he eliminated 542 Soviet soldiers in less than 100 days. To this day, he remains the deadliest sniper in military history. But the war was not merely a contest of numbers, it was also a battle of psychological endurance. For Soviet troops, any noise from the trees, a snapping branch, a gust of wind, could signal an approaching Finnish squad. The constant tension, overwhelming fear, and psychological terror led to collective breakdowns, nervous collapses, desertions, and in many cases, suicides. Furious and humiliated, Stalin responded in the only way he knew: escalation. He ordered massive reinforcements, sent heavy tanks, more aircraft, and brutally increased artillery fire. At the same time, he dismissed generals, executed officers accused of cowardice, and imposed extremely harsh punishments for any perceived weakness within the Red Army. By February 1940, the Soviets abandoned the idea of advancing in columns and switched to a saturation strategy: relentless bombardments, intensive use of flamethrowers, anti-personnel mines, and artillery barrages capable of firing 300,000 shells in just 24 hours against the Mannerheim Line, Finland's main defensive fortification. The resistance was nothing short of heroic. Bunkers, trenches, and fortifications were carved directly into rock and snow. Fighting groups, often composed of just a dozen men, held out for days, isolated, without reinforcements, facing entire battalions of the Red Army. Meanwhile, on the home front, the entire Finnish society mobilized. Women produced thermal clothing, improvised weapons, and food for the soldiers. Children helped with logistics. Everyone understood that this war was not just about territory, it was a war for the very survival of the nation. Yet the pressure became unsustainable. Despite losing over 168,000 soldiers killed, more than 265,000 wounded, over 5,000 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and nearly 900 aircraft shot down, the Soviet Union simply possessed infinite reserves of men and resources. Faced with the imminent collapse of the defensive line, the Finnish government opted to negotiate. But it was not a surrender. It was a negotiation carried out with the weight of having shown the world that Finland knew how to fight. On March 13, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland lost 11% of its territory, including Viipuri, Viborg, part of Karelia, and the Hanko Peninsula. More than 422,000 Finnish civilians were displaced, forced to leave their homes and abandon everything. But above all, Finland kept what mattered most: its freedom, its sovereignty, and its independence. The global repercussions were enormous. Hitler, witnessing the disastrous performance of the Red Army, mistakenly concluded that the Soviet Union was a giant with feet of clay, a perception that led him to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the largest military invasion in human history, forever altering the course of World War II. On the other hand, the USSR learned brutal lessons. The failure in Finland forced Stalin to accelerate military reforms. The development of the T-34 tank, the Yak-1 fighter, the SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles, and the legendary PPS-H-41 submachine gun were all directly influenced by the lessons of the Winter War. The Soviets also completely overhauled their doctrines in artillery, logistics, and decentralized command. More than that, the Winter War permanently shaped the identity of Finland. The concept of sisu, which represents extreme resilience, irrational courage, and the willingness to keep fighting when there is no hope left, became the spiritual and cultural foundation of the Finnish people. The Winter War taught the world that victory does not always belong to the largest, the richest, or the best armed. Sometimes victory belongs to those who know their terrain, who have a deeper reason to fight, and who absolutely refuse to kneel. And on that snow, in that brutal winter of 1939, Finland proved that even the greatest of empires can be stopped. Because freedom, when defended by those willing to sacrifice everything, becomes simply invincible. The Winter War, 1939 to 1940, was not just a battle for land, it was an existential fight. Tiny Finland, facing one of the most powerful military machines in history, proved to the world that courage, resilience, and intelligence can overcome brute force. Despite losing part of its territory, Finland preserved what truly mattered: its freedom, its sovereignty, and its dignity as a sovereign nation. For the Soviet Union, it was a harsh reminder that you cannot underestimate a people fighting not just for land, but for their very existence. The legacy of this war echoes today as a symbol of human resistance against oppression. The snow, the cold, and the terrain were not enemies. They were allies of freedom. And in that cruel winter, it was proven forever that freedom, when defended with conviction, is simply invincible.